And a good Friday afternoon, morning, evening, Saturday morning, depending on where you are in the world right now. Welcome to the Friday Happy Hour live webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie. It's July 9th, 2021, and a very hot, summery day around here. It's about close to 30 degrees Celsius. Boiling hot, pretty much, almost, if you want to convert it into Fahrenheit, around 90 degrees or so, nice and humid, sticky, perfect whiskey drinking weather. Inside, of course, in the air conditioning. Hope you've had a great week. It's been a fun week around here. You may have seen pictures earlier today on social media. We got a couple of new kittens running around the house, and at some point during this webcast, you may not hear the kittens, but I can pretty much guarantee you're going to hear the dog raising hell because he wants to try to get to the kittens and play with them. So you may hear that at some point. Hopefully we'll keep him quiet. So let's have a little bit of fun right now. We're going to bring in one of our guests today, one of our longtime friends, Stephanie Macleod, the master blender for Dewars and the Dewars single malts in alphabetical order: Aberfeldy, Aultmore, Craigellachie, the Deveron, and Royal Brackla. I think I've got that correct, right?
You have, yes. Good evening. It's great to be back. It's actually been quite warm in Glasgow today. We seem to be having a summer, which is quite unusual for Scotland, especially in July.
Well, you may have it for just a few days and then fall will come back. It's the typical Glasgow summer. I have to ask you about this because I was looking at my iPad today, yes, and the daily record from Scotland turns up with this picture of you and a new Dewars expression, the 175 blend. Got to have you tell us about this because this just came out today, right?
Yeah. So this year, 2021, is the 175th anniversary of Dewars. So in 1846, John Dewar opened his shop in Perth, and that's where the legacy of Dewars began. And so we wanted to celebrate it. We still really don't know how we're going to physically celebrate it amongst all our colleagues in Scotland, but we thought we need to make a blend, to celebrate it. And what we did was the date was the 15th of May, and all the malt whiskies and the grain whiskies were selected on the basis that they were filled into oak on the 15th of May. And that's from across our inventory. And so we've come up with a really beautiful blend, packed with fruit, packed with spiciness, and we're really pleased with it. And we've got this kind of retro style with it as well. So the white tops. We looked back in the archives to see what we were doing then, and we've kind of come up with a homage to past labels and past blends. It's really exciting.
Where is this going to be available? I know it went on sale today on the Dewars website in the UK.
Yeah, well, the UK. So you can order online, but you can only have it if you're in the UK. You would have to come over to Scotland to get it in person, and it's a very limited edition. So when it's gone, it's gone. But who knows what could happen? If the demand's there, we'll meet it.
The demand will be there. We want it over here in the States. I know none's coming over here yet, but I know we want it over here in the States because we got something else instead. And I see you wearing your jacket from the U.S. Open at Torrey Pines, and this is the 19-year-old Champions Edition that just came out for the U.S. Open this year. Yeah. Tell us about this one.
Well, so we've never had this relationship before. with the US Open. So, we were all really excited about it. And so the guys in the States came up with the idea of the 19th hole and Dewars 19. So it was a real nod to the 19th hole and where golfers go to commiserate and to celebrate after a round of golf. And we thought, what better way to do that than with, a Dewars 19-year-old blended Scotch whiskey. And as a further nod to the fact that it's in the US, we finished it in bourbon casks. So you're getting this double joy of it's 19 years old, but also we've got that little finesse, that lovely vanilla spice coming through with finishing it in the bourbon oak. And our plans are in place for what could come next. So we're really excited about that as well. So we're absolutely bursting with pride. The jacket's got the Dewars emblem on the side, and it just looks great. And I'm not a golfer myself, but I'm certainly looking the part at the moment with all my golfing gear on. But
all you need is a visor.
I know, that's right. I've got a baseball hat, actually. Could have worn that.
Well, that's not the one I'm drinking right now, because what I've got in my glass is the one we sort of talked about a couple of weeks ago and showed off. Dewars Japanese Smooth, Mizunara Oak finish. And I know folks have questions about this because I started getting questions as soon as I talked about it 2 weeks ago here on the webcast. This is part of the Smooth collection, the fourth release in that range. But Misonara Oak, tell me about this, because as I recall, you've not worked with Mizunara before, right?
No. Yeah, we like to do this to ourselves. We like to put ourselves under intense pressure, keeping our fingers crossed. I mean, we literally had the discussion about Mizunara at the very start of the pandemic, which, when I think about it now, was crazy, but we didn't think it was going to last quite as long as it did. So what we did was we ordered 5 of these Mizunara casks, because we thought, we've never used these before. Let's try them. But because there's such a long lead time, they are made in Japan, that we actually had to place the order for the full amount before the trial ones had arrived. So it really was, riding by the seat of our pants. So we put various whiskies into the 5 casks that we had, and one of them was Dewars 8, because that's what we wanted to start with. And as we always do, we monitored it on a monthly basis. And as I was saying to you earlier, when we got the sample out after a month, I thought to myself, that looks darker. And I thought it was wishful thinking, but then we measured it, and yes, indeed, it had started to take on the color. So 3 months, we started to get more of the character coming through from the Mizunara wood. And again, I'd heard I'd heard lots of wonderful things about Mizunara, but I'd heard some things that they sometimes leak, or they don't behave quite the way you expect them to. But I have to say, these casks have been a dream to work with, and they look so beautiful. They really do. I mean, we're almost, bowing down before them when they arrived, and they all arrived individually wrapped. They really were beautiful. So it's been really exciting. Excuse me. It's been really exciting, just seeing how they develop, and so I didn't want to leave them in the casks for too long. But what I've got is stock that is still sitting in the casks so that we can monitor it for longer to see what does it do over months and years, so that in the future we can plan ahead and know without a shred of doubt that 3 months is the magic number, or is it 6 months, or is it a year? So these exciting experiments are going on just now.
I'm curious about the use of these as finishing casks, because we know that, for instance, you have first fill, second fill barrels used for regular maturation, and you get so much life out of those before you retire them after 2 or 3 uses, for anywhere between 8 and 15, 20 years or whatever. But how many uses can you get out of a finishing cask when you're only finishing it, say, for that 3 to 6 month period?
Well, we're hoping we'll get quite a lot of uses out of them, because we are finishing them. So when you fill a cask with new make spirit, it's about, we fill about sort of mid-60s. And so the alcohol content is really drawing everything out of the cask. But when we're finishing it, we're filling the casks with spirit with a much lower alcohol content. And so it's not as harsh on the cask. It's gentler with it. The interactions are much more gentle. And so it's not drawing the same maturation compounds from the wood as new make spirit. But what we're doing is we're not only looking at the color and the flavor, we're also looking at the maturation related compounds, which we do using HPLC. And that actually tells us how much vanillin and all the other maturation related compounds are coming out the wood each time we fill it. And so it will get to a point where we'll look at all 3 sets of data and decide, break the news to our finance people that we need to buy more of these very expensive casks. So it'll all be data-led with what we're doing.
I know that I shocked some folks a couple of weeks ago when I told them that this is being priced in the U.S. at $24.99 a bottle. And people were going, "You're kidding," because Misonara Oak generally tends to be priced at a premium around the whiskey industry. I know that's a different department. You referred to the accountants, but how can you guys price this for $24.99?
Well, at Dewars, we very much believe in that whiskey is for everybody. And normally we associate Mizunara, and indeed any finish, with single malts. But what we're doing is we are applying finishing also to blends, and it's an 8-year-old blend. And so by doing that, we are then allowing everyone to have access to finishes that are normally the preserve of single malts, which are more expensive. So really that's, that is not my department, pricing. But that is our thinking behind it. It's democratizing whiskey enjoyment, because we don't want whiskey to be stuck in a cabinet, waiting for it to increase in value. We want people to drink whiskey and enjoy it and appreciate it for what it is. That's what whiskey was made for giving comfort, for bringing cheer and getting friends together. And that's what we want. And we're passionate about smoothness. We're passionate about flavor. And that's what the Smooth series is there to do. And, it's really been successful beyond our wildest dreams. People are really embracing it, and I know they're just waiting to know what are we going to bring out next. And so it's really exciting for us.
Want to break some news? Go ahead. I promise we won't tell anybody.
Yeah. Is it just
I'm kidding. But our pal Gregoire Serafian in France was complaining earlier that he wants more of your whiskeys in France, which we know is a country that loves blended Scotch whiskey. And he wants this one especially in France. Do you know if this one is going to make it over there?
I think it is. Yeah, maybe not this year, but we've certainly got plans to get it out wider. And it's probably somebody in France shouting at me just now, but I'm pretty sure it's going to go to France. They have said it.
And one more question on Mizunara. Dave Kuhn wants to know where does Mizunara fall in sort of the spectrum of flavor ranges that you get out of a cask between American oak and European oak? Is it off on a different level than those two somewhere? Is it in the middle? Where is it?
Yeah.
Or are you still figuring it out since you're still learning with it?
Yeah, we are a bit. It's definitely not. It's not European. European oak tends to give color very, very quickly. And American oak is just slightly behind it. But this one gives color, but not to the same degree as European oak or indeed American oak. So it's much gentler in all respects, and we don't seem to get the same level of tannins that we get with American oak. So it really is fascinating wood, and I would like to look at it in more detail, the chemistry of it and why it does what it does. And even to look at it, it's very pale. The Mizunara Oak, and we've actually taken some photographs of it. We got a woman, German photographer, and she took some beautiful pictures of the Misonara Oak, and it's almost ghostly actually, and it's got a kind of luminous effect to it when it's in the warehouse. So yeah, it's like no other wood that I've worked with before.
I can't wait to get over there because as a photographer, I want to see this. If it's sort of an ethereal type view, I want to see what that looks like because I've not had the chance to photograph Misonara Oak at all, so it could be interesting.
Yes, you're most welcome.
Now we have some great questions here coming in. Our pal Crump says he would love to have a Dewars peated cask finish, and that would be lovely. I know that the scratched cask wasn't quite a smoky or a peated finish, but is there anything that you can point him to that might satisfy that?
I can't point him to anything at the moment, but there is something that will be coming out probably next year.
Okay.
It's not a full peaty finish, and there's other elements in there, but we haven't completed it yet. But there is a plan to do something like that.
And part of that is because John Dewar Sons, the division of Bacardi, doesn't have a distillery on Isla, so it's not as though you have to basically barter for your peated whiskeys, correct?
Yes. We have reciprocal deals with other companies. I mean, we could make a peaty version of Aberfeldy or Royal or any of our distilleries. But I don't know. We don't feel the need at the moment to do that, and we can sometimes get something quite interesting if we do it as finish rather than changing the distillery. It may be something that we do, but we have to be careful what we do with peat bogs as well, because they are a carbon sink. So possibly we'll leave it to the experts in making peaty whiskey rather than adding to it with doing something at the distilleries that might not work. So I think a peaty finish is probably the way that we will go with this, rather than making a peaty single malt.
We probably ought to explain, this is one of the unsung parts of the blender's trade, is working with your colleagues across the industry, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, especially in the Scotch whiskey industry. We're a small country with this huge global product, Scotch whiskey. And, so what we do is, although we're fierce competitors in the marketplace, we reciprocate with one another. So, other whiskey companies will take our whiskies and we will exchange them for theirs. And that's how we make our blends. So we depend on each other. And so it's in all our best interests to be making the best whiskey that we can and helping each other to make the best whiskey that we can. So we have the Scotch Whisky Research Institute that you don't have to be a member of, but you can be. And through that forum, we share knowledge at the pre-competitive point. So we're not going to share our sales figures. We're not going to share our blend recipes. But if someone is experiencing a problem with the malted barley or a type of yeast, or we want to do some trials, then we'll all work together and share the knowledge that we have. And sometimes even spare parts. So a distillery could break down, a neighbouring distillery might not be from the same company, but if they've got that part, chances are that they'll give it to them. So it really is, and that's why people stay in the whiskey industry, because we have this sense of camaraderie and a very social aspect to it as well, although not at the moment.
Graham Fraser had a great question, and since we alluded to Dewars and Bacardi not owning an Islay distillery, you don't own a grain distillery either. So how do you get your grain whiskeys? I assume through similar sourcing contracts with places like North British and everybody else and their brother that own Invergordon and all the other grain distilleries?
Yeah, that's it. We have to reciprocate, and there's a big capacity in Scotland for grain, and we just take advantage of that.
I had a great question here and I'm just trying to pull it up. While I am getting to the great question, let me ask another one, because we had Connor O'Hare wanted to know if you've thought about trying a beer cask finish. Those have been popular lately. Maybe working with one of the Scottish brewers.
We've done that actually, not with Dewars. We did it with our sibling brand, William Lawson's, and it was a one-off for France actually, and it was in an IPA beer cask, and we did a swap. So we gave them our whiskey casks. They filled it with beer. They then emptied it, bottled it as a whiskey finish beer. We got the casks back and filled it with our whiskey. So, and it was really a really beautiful whiskey. I really loved it. So, yes, we would probably change some things because, again, we didn't know what we were doing. And so we had a lot of learnings from it, but certainly in terms of flavor, it was amazing. It was really very fresh. That sort of grapefruit flavor that you get from an IPA. It was really coming through in the whiskey. So I really loved it. It's great.
I talk a lot about us living in a regrettably dry town here in New Jersey, but we do have a pretty good little microbrewery that has been open for a couple of years now, within walking distance of here. And I joke about this, but Bader has become a regular there, our dog, because we walk in the afternoon, we will stop in, have a pint in the grand Scottish tradition, and sitting outside, and Bader gets more attention there than I do. I mean, everybody comes up and hugs him. But if you're looking for a brewery to do some cask swaps with or do an exchange with, I can put you in touch with a good one here if you want to try one at the Dewars, for instance. We can talk about that offline.
Yeah, send it on. Yeah, that'd be great.
I found the question from Graham Fraser now. As you develop your blending skills over time, and I say that because blending skills do develop over time. It's not like you've pretty much peaked as a blender. You're always evolving. But do you find that your nosing sensitivities change over time and you become sensitive to different aromas?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think I've always been most sensitive actually to off notes. And I think probably most people are the same. That if something isn't right, then I pick it up. But definitely, I don't think there's any such thing as knowing everything about whiskey, because whiskey constantly surprises us. Because we put, fill 2 casks with the same spirit on the same day, both into sherry casks or both into bourbon casks. And you find that the whiskies are completely different from one another. And I think actually, going back to my sense of smell and flavor perception, I think there are times of day when I'm perhaps better, and it's usually first thing in the morning that I'm more liable to pick things up. Whereas writing flavor notes or tasting notes, I tend to do that better at home and at night. So I have no idea why that would be. It's just over the years I kind of learned when I'm best. And sometimes
Go ahead.
Leaving a glass for a long time, rather than pouring a dram and then nosing it straight away, giving it that time just to settle, to explore. That really makes, I've learned to my cost that it's important to do that. So I think we all tend to learn most by making mistakes, and that's an unfortunate thing. But when you're kind of learning on the job, because there isn't a course on becoming a master blender. Obviously we learn from the recipes that we have and from advice that we're given, but you only do it by doing it. And I've got a much bigger team now. I've got a new assistant blender called Rianne Ferguson, and she is just starting out in the whiskey industry. And so I'm trying to kind of teach her everything that I know so that she doesn't go through the pain of making mistakes. And, so, and obviously she will, but hopefully not as many as I have.
I know Rianne worked with you on the 175 blend. I did read the news release on it. Yeah. How do you train up a new apprentice blender? How do you teach them?
Well, as I say, there isn't a special course, but what I do is ensure that she's there when we're working on something new. And we've got plenty that's new at the moment. So when casks come in, so new types of casks, like the other day we got a whole load of French wine casks in, and other interesting bits and pieces. So the two of us went up along with our student, actually, and we all set about nosing these casks, and we're there with our bits of chalk, scoring any that we didn't think were quite right. So basically, if Rianne says something not quite sure about this, I have a nose at it as well, and we kind of talk about it, and either it's, yeah, you're right, it's not quite right, or actually, if we fill this with water and empty it out the next day, let's have a look at it then. So it's really just by shadowing, and also taking on projects like the Dewars 175, and making up blends and giving her feedback, so that the next time she'll be able to pin it down much more quickly.
You mentioned the change in when you get your tasting notes, doing tasting notes, say at home at night, as opposed to being in your blending lab. I'm curious. That raised a really interesting question in my mind because of the pandemic, when everybody had to work from home. Did you find that you had difficulties making the transition from nosing whiskies full time in the blending lab for blends and evaluating samples, and being used to that environment in your blending lab, to then taking them home and doing them and trying to keep everything consistent? Was there a difference in changing the location where you do your nosing?
Actually, in Scotland, the whiskey industry was seen as an almost protected industry. So we pretty much kept going. I mean, we obviously had to have social distancing, and all the precautions. We reduced quite a lot of the things we were doing. But I was pretty much in work most days, actually, during the pandemic. So I'd maybe come in 2 or 3 days a week, depending on what was happening. So we were still blending, we were still bottling, right the way through, and shipping. So whenever people were saying, about they took up new hobbies and they did this and that during the pandemic, I was like, really? I was still making whiskey. And I think I probably would have gone a bit mad, actually, if I had just been working from home. I do find that I get energy from the workplace. It's quite nice to tumble out of bed and on the laptop, but I do prefer, and as you say, nosing in your lab environment is much better than bringing it home with all the aromas that you have in the house that aren't as familiar as in the blending room. So
I find when I'm here at home that I sort of, certain aromas tend to go into the background for me, and I just don't pick up on them around the house. And it still lets me nose good whiskeys and pick up those aromas. But do you find the same thing at home? The background aromas, things like the pets and stuff like that, that will throw you off at home rather than being in the lab?
Well, sometimes I actually, if it's a nice day, I like to actually go outside and do my flavor notes. And actually, I think sometimes I am slightly influenced when I'm in the garden. And so there are a lot more references to flowers and herbs because the Aultmore series, I wrote those tasting notes in the summer, and it's all about herbs and ethereal notes and fragrance, and I thought, I wonder if it'd been different if I'd written that in the winter. So I think I am affected by seasonality when I'm writing tasting notes. Giving away all my secrets here tonight.
We did not plan this, but your reference to Aultmore was perfect timing because I received many years ago, back in 2014 or so, this full bottle at the time of Aultmore 21-year-old from your colleagues in the sample room. There's this much of it left still this many years later, so I wanted to switch to an Aultmore 21. But we occasionally get some cheeky comments from our listeners, and in this case, Watchman 999 is one. In the spirit of double-double, is there a chance that Dewars will come out with a smooth bottling? Come on, Watchman, you know better.
Or a smooth bottling. We have thought of that, actually. Lots of O's in the middle. You never know.
Well, it was like with Ardbeg, with the one that they did for Mickey Heads last fall. You could do a smooth, something like that. Yes, as Ricker points out, cheeky us. Yes, you guys. Yes, that's our crowd. Dave Kuhn, interesting comment about seasonality in tasting notes. Do you find that your tasting notes may change between seasons if you go back and taste something?
I think it does. I think my tasting notes are meant as a guide to what I would like our whiskey drinkers to look at and say, I recognize that, or I don't recognize that. I'm going to buy a bottle of that because that is something I haven't tried before. So that's what I'm trying to do. But I do think that either the air pressure or the surroundings that you're in do affect the way that you perceive flavor, and also the things that you've eaten prior to nosing. So I try not to eat strong foods before I assess whiskey. I don't wear perfume at work. So all these kind of things that might affect the experience of nosing and writing down my thoughts, I try to keep those to a minimum. But I do think there is some sort of seasonality. And sometimes I think about when a product is going to be released when I'm writing the tasting notes as well. So that it kind of, and another thing I like to do is when I was traveling, is that the countries that I go to, I ask them for their flavor notes, because I tend to use things that I know about. So it might be, confectionery from when I was a child. I'll bring that into my tasting notes. But somebody in Japan isn't going to know what pear drops are. Or they might do now because everybody talks about them in tasting notes. But so I like to ask them, so how would you describe that particular flavor? And they'll tell me, what they get from it. And I'll try then and incorporate that in tasting notes to make them more universal so that everybody can understand them and be guided in the right direction.
Sort of like the infamous Christmas cake tasting note that's that catch-all for fruitcake flavors and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. And Christmas cake does perfectly encapsulate everything about a sherry whiskey, because it's got the fruit, it's got the alcohol, it's got the spice, And so if you're limited for the number of characters because you're going to put it on a label, then Christmas cake just sums it all up. But not everybody celebrates Christmas. Not everybody likes Christmas cake. So we have to find other ways of describing whiskey, really.
But Christmas cake is primarily a UK term. It's not used, say, over here in North America. We'd call it fruit cake or something like that. So Christmas cake tends to confuse people outside of the UK. So we have a great question here from Tyrone Cote, our pal in Nova Scotia. Back in 1987, numerous cases of Dewars Scotch were recovered from the shipwreck of the SS Regina that sank in Lake Huron back in 1913. Would Dewars consider doing a recreation of that? We're 2 years away from the 110th anniversary of that. That sounds like something the marketing department, I know certain colleagues of yours are watching this, and that might be an opportunity.
Well, do you know, I'm going to say to my colleague, Jackie Sargent, who is our archivist, and we're going to look back and see if we can find anything in this, because that does sound like a very fitting tribute. We will look into that. Thank you.
Presumably, Jackie has samples of whiskey from that era in the archives. It's not just all documents and labels and things like that. I know she keeps whiskeys in there too, right?
Yeah, I mean, people are very kind. A lot of people are clearing out attics, and some people, we can't understand why, they'll keep whiskey in an attic and not drink it. But it's great for us because, these are really interesting finds. And sometimes we do, Brian Cox is just saying, let's taste it. Sometimes we do take a little sample from it and see what it was like. Now, it's not going to be as it was back then, because whiskey does change through time. It's not hermetically sealed in the bottle. So there is the interaction with the air, but it's just so interesting. And you really do feel a sense of awe that, it's so old and what was happening at the time that it was made. So thank you for bringing that up, and we will look into that. That sounds like a great idea.
Then again, Tyrone had the cheeky comment that the Canadians can help with winter tasting notes. They have 4,000 different words for snow. So they can probably help you on that front.
That'd be great.
And Dave Kuhn is suggesting calling it Dewars Scattered on the Rocks or Dewars Capsized. Guys, come on.
Okay.
Graham Fraser has a question. During Aberfeldy Distillery, there's a display showing the 40-plus whiskeys that went into the original Dewars blend. Many of those are now lost to distilleries. Have you ever sampled any of those? And I'm guessing this might be the case, are those, shall we say, representations of those whiskeys? Because I doubt that you're going to put a valuable sample of a really old whiskey in that display case, knowing that people have been known to break into visitor centers to grab whiskeys.
Yeah. It is purely for display purposes, because they're not even in a cabinet. They're there for you to touch. So no, they're not the real thing.
So it's not real whiskey in those bottles.
It is whiskey, because we did look at putting coloured water in it, but coloured water does not remain pristine. So it is whiskey that's there, but it's just not those particular ones. And
Watchman came back with a Huron Smooth for the Canadian. Okay. Kent Moore wants to know, are you a foodie, Stephanie? Do you enjoy different foods? And do you wonder which foods your blends would work with when you're cooking?
Yes, so that is something that we do consider, actually, not when I'm making a blend, but when we have created the blend, we do think about what would it go with, because people are really interested now in pairing whiskey with food. And it's so good to hear that, because people have enjoyed for years, wine and food. And, there's a wonderful dinner in Scotland called the Keepers of the Quaich. And they famously match a different whiskey with every course. And, obviously it's much stronger than wine is, but it's not in as big a glass. And it's really interesting to see how the different flavors of the whiskey interact with the different food. I mean, an Islay malt and blue cheese is a thing of beauty. I mean, it really is. It's
Yeah.
just is beautiful. And what we do at Dewars Aberfeldy Distillery at the Visitor Centre is we do a chocolate pairing. And a lot of people have said, what, chocolate and whiskey? How on earth does that work? But they really are very similar. Now,
They
why
work
you
brilliantly.
think? Oh, yes, good. I thought you
Yeah.
were saying no.
Oh, no, 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 no. I can't
It's
believe people
amazing.
haven't figured that out.
Yeah, because they both they seem to melt at the same time on the palate, and it's just it's beautiful. And I haven't actually met a chocolate yet that doesn't go. So really expensive chocolate or cheaper chocolate, as long as it's good chocolate, it goes with whiskey. So yeah, don't be afraid to explore that, because it really does. It really works well. And so yes, I do love food. Um, I love experimenting with food. Um, Sometimes I cook with whiskey, and it's just always such a joy to kind of get that little hint of the whiskey just coming through in the dish. One time I remember being in Russia, and there was a chef, and he made a pumpkin risotto with Dewars 12, and
Ooh.
it was delicious. So there's a tip for maybe for Halloween. Pumpkin risotto for Halloween
We'll have
with
to get the
gold.
recipe for that
Yeah.
somehow. Dave Kuhn wants to know, do you have a favorite nosing or tasting note, something that always makes you happy when you find it in a whiskey?
I love finding coconut. That really makes me happy when I find coconut. And I don't always find it first time. Generally has to be just the right strength and the right type of whiskey of the right age. But I love finding coconut, and also menthol. I love getting that kind of menthol zing that comes through. That kind of freshness, especially if it's an old whiskey and it's got lots of complexity going on. It's just nice to get that little zing of menthol that comes through. And
I'm getting that right now in this Aultmore 21.
yeah,
We have a good question here from Graham Fraser. How much time do you spend focusing on Dewars as opposed to the single malts?
I would say it's equal, really. Sometimes we have more Dewars projects going on at one point and less malts. And other times it's other way around, just depending on where we are in the cycle of the year. So I would say it was about equal, because there's especially with the malts, there's a lot of sampling goes on with the malts. it's usually done ahead of time so that there's no surprises come up when we go to bottle. So we probably do more individual sampling of the malts, and obviously we do a lot of finishes on the malts. So we're doing a lot with red wine finishes, dessert wine finishes. So, and that takes a lot of monitoring as well. So that's why the team is getting bigger, so that there's lots of eyes, lots of noses are on the whiskies.
What do you look for when you're looking for a candidate to join the blending team? What qualifications do you want?
I'm generally looking for a science background. That's my background. And I feel with science, whiskey is lots of compounds that are coming together and changing all the time, whether if we're adding water to it or indeed in the cask, lots of interactions are going on. So if you have an understanding of chemistry, and how these interactions occur and what they can produce, then I think that does help in your understanding of whiskey. But obviously, every new candidate goes through a nosing test. And it's really just to see, and it's obviously blind. But I'm not always just looking for the exactly right answer. So, I'm not just looking for them to say it's a single malt. I want them to tell me what it is about it. What are the notes that are standing out for them? Why is it different to the other ones? So I'm not really just looking for, oh, that's a single malt, and I think it might be Aberfeldy. I'm looking for how do they describe it. So that's very important. And just enthusiasm and a curiosity about them. That they want to know how things work, why things happen, and how things could be made even better. So that these are the qualities I'm looking for.
We've had a bunch of pushback on the question about those samples that are on display in Aberfeldy. People are asking if you actually have had the chance to try the whiskey from those closed distilleries.
There's lots of them that have been closed for many years, and so no, I haven't tried them, but there are actually a lot of the whiskies that are in the Dewars blend. When we were looking back in the archives, when we were doing some research for the 175, those whiskies are, we were using them back then. So it's, it is quite funny to look at them and say, yeah, gosh, that we put that into the blend the other day. So yes, it's there. Although there are a lot of distilleries that have shut down, recently Scotland has been opening up a lot of these distilleries, because the demand for Scotch is now going through the roof. So possibly I will get to try these whiskies again, but in a new form.
But do you go back to Jackie, your archivist, to find out what samples she has from way back in the archives in the cupboards to see what she has and take a syringe maybe and taste a little bit of it?
Yeah, so not particularly samples of individual makes that go into the distillery, into the whiskey at the time, but certainly old bottles, and we have done that. We've opened one of the bottles and took a sample of it just to see what was it like. And as I say, you know that it's not exactly as it was. But I think what struck me was that there was perhaps heavier notes in the whiskey then. And, you know, because everything was peat fired, was coal fired, there was that heavier aspect to the whiskey. But again, we don't know if it was exactly like that at the time, or if it's the effect of the whiskey has been sitting and changing as it's been in the bottle, because we don't know the environment in which these bottles were held over all these years. But
And
yeah,
also the malt and grain content. The malt content may have been higher back then.
it may have been higher. You know, it's really hard to see, and it's hard to tell from the recipes as well, because everything was kind of written down. Some of the handwriting is faded, so you can't really see exact quantities of what was being put in.
Let me give you a hypothetical question. I give you a time machine. You can go back and save any distillery from Scotland's history that's been closed for however many years. Which one do you save and why?
Oh, that would be a horrible decision to make. I don't think I could do that. Because I guess so much history and so many lives are you know, are wedded to these distilleries, that would be an awful decision to make. But you know, what my hope is that people are now resurrecting these distilleries, like Rosebank is coming back, and hopefully it will be as it was. So that one I was pleased to see that one was coming back. But yeah, no, I couldn't go back and make a decision like that. That would be awful.
Harder than closing it in the first place and the person who had to make that decision?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's all sorts of reasons as to why a distillery shuts down. So it could be that the character, they just couldn't maintain it. You know, whiskey has gone through peaks and troughs, and so perhaps there just wasn't the demand for it. Thankfully, I've never had to make that decision of shutting down a distillery, and I wouldn't like that job at all, because, you know, all the whiskies add something, not only to the towns that they're in, but also to the richness of our blends as well. So, you know, we want as much diversity as we possibly can in distilling in Scotland, so that we have really interesting blends.
Interesting
Was that
question
question
from,
well?
yeah. Good question here from Donner Pass Whiskey. Would you ever consider, and he says concede, I think he meant consider, doing a special blend of Dewars without Aberfeldy as the dominant malt, say a Craigellachie dominant malt or a blend?
Yeah, it depends on the blend that we're making. Craigellachie has a very different flavour profile to Aberfeldy, and some malts are better at getting on with other malts than others. And we have done some special blends in the past. So our distilleries manager from a while ago, Chris Anderson, when he left, I made up a blend of all 5 of our distilleries because he was in charge of all 5. And it was quite a difficult one to do because they're all quite different distilleries, and Craigellachie at certain ages, when it gets to 13, more of the muscular notes, the sort of cordite character, the kind of sulfury notes are starting to recede. So depending on the age of it, you have to use it either sparingly, or you can start to use it in a greater amount. So it just depends on the age of the blend. But yes, it's a nice idea. But the reason that we talk about Aberfeldy and Dewars is that, you know, Aberfeldy was the only distillery to have been built by the Dewars family. And so that's, I like to imagine that A.J. Cameron, our first master blender, you know, took his inspiration for white label from Aberfeldy and the character. And I don't know whether they thought too deeply then about what character they wanted to produce. You know, I don't know, but certainly there are similarities between the flavor profile of Aberfeldy and that of white label.
And Tyrone asked this earlier, but didn't get to it, but he'll ask it. He asked it again, so I'm going to repeat it. He is an avid reader. Is there any chance there might be a book published to celebrate the 175th anniversary? I know that several years ago, I think probably almost 10 years ago, Ian Buxton put out a book, The Enduring History of Dewars, on the distillery. And I've heard there's talk that may be updated for a new edition, but hadn't heard anything on it recently. Might there be a book to celebrate the 175th?
One is being worked on. It's not necessarily, I don't think it was necessarily to celebrate the 175th, but I think it was felt that it should be updated to reflect all the things that have happened recently. So it is being worked on. I haven't seen it yet, but I have certainly heard that it is happening and might be close to completion. So that's a really good question. Thank you. And
since Greg Serafian in Paris has been asking to get your whiskies for some time over the last hour, we might see someday a 40-year-old Dewars?
Yes, I hope so. Quite soon.
Is this one of these watch these space teas things?
Yeah. Yeah.
We will leave it at that. Stephanie, thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's late over there, and we appreciate the time as always. Our pal Stephanie Macleod, the master blender for Dewars and the single malts from the John Dewar Sons portfolio. The Aberfeldy, Aultmore, this 21-year-old still holds up, even though there's not much left. Craigellachie, the Deveron, and Royal Brackla. And you can find out more, of course, at Dewars.com. And that 175 blend is available if you live in the UK. And I know we have a bunch of listeners in the UK. And on that note about the book, Tyrone says, yeah, all right. So hopefully we've made you happy, Tyrone. Stephanie, have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us. It has been a pleasure as always. And Sláinte, thank you for all the great whiskeys.
Sláinte. Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Gang, thanks for joining us tonight on the Happy Hour Live webcast. We will have the podcast up this weekend as usual, and we'll have another Happy Hour Live webcast next Friday night. Until we meet again, I'm Mark Gillespie. So long, everyone.